Why Physically Realizable Sciences Are Not Applicable by Francis T.S. narrated by Ann Yu. Do you know that all the physically realizable sciences cannot be repeated? Why physically realizable sciences cannot be used for application? It is because every applicable science must be repeated, for which they must be approximated, since every physically realizable science can only occur once, from which it is wrong to assume that physically realizable consequences are applicable. The differences between physically realizability and non-physically realizability is that one physically exists and the other does not physically exist. For example, practically all our fundamental laws of physics are not physically realizable, since all of them were derived on an empty, timeless t=0 platform, which have violated the first law of time, in other words, temporal t is greater than 0, from which every physically realizable science emerges only once at current moment of time, in other words, t is equal to 0, as depicted in Figure 1, which cannot be repeated since applicable sciences must be repeatable. Figure 1 shows a one and only once physically realizable consequence of our universe. Differences between applicable and physically realizable sciences. Since any applicable realizable science must be repeatable, but physically realizable sciences cannot be repeated, so what is the role of knowing physically realizable sciences? It must be the principle or law of no violation. As I have shown, one, practicality, all our analytical sciences have violated physically realizable principle, since the origin of our sciences were mathematically developed on a virtually empty space platform, for which all of them were violated the law of nature, in other words, law of temporal, t is greater than 0. Because every physically realizable science cannot be repeated, we see that they are not applicable, from which any applicable science must be repeatable, of which must be approximated. Thus, all applicable sciences must be approximated, repeatable sciences, for which we see that repeated sciences are not strictly physically realizable. Yet, without repeated sciences, we have no applicable science. This is from FTSU Introduction to Physically Realizable Physics. Why fundamental principles must be physically realizable. Since science is a descriptive mathematical language speaking the truth, and the truth must be the physically realizable, which cannot be virtual as mathematics. However, every physically realizable science can only exist once at a time, which cannot be repeated since our universe has one and only one reality at a given time. Although it is not possible to exploit any of those physically realizable sciences for application, but the knowledge of physically realizable science enables us to understand that this principle cannot be violated. Yet scores of modern physical laws have severely violated the physically realizable principle, which have created a dark age of our modern science for over a century. For examples such as Einstein's relativity theory, superposition principle of Schrödinger, antimatter of Dirac, QED of Feynman, and many others. Why that we have not discovered where the source comes from It must be due to a score of mathematically oriented physicists who have treated mathematics as a science. But unfortunately, mathematics is not a science, although science is mathematics. In other words, without mathematics, analytical science seems not where to go. It is because science needs a simple mathematical language to facilitate its complicated description, of which without a symbolic mathematical language, it would be very difficult to apply in science. Why applicable sciences are approximated. Since all the physically realizable sciences are real, yet cannot be repeated, because every consequence within our universe is once only consequence, thus it cannot be exploited. But all applicable sciences must be repeatable, thus approximated, for which we see that any solution as obtained derived from mathematical physics is doomed to be non-physically realizable or false. Firstly, violate the law of temporal, t is greater than 0. Secondly, even its solution is physically realizable, but it is still not an applicable solution, since principle of physically realizable only guarantees that it is physically existed, but not repeatable for application. To be repeatable, any physical realizable science must be approximated, but violates the law of temporal, t is greater than 0, in which we see that any applicable science cannot be strictly physically realizable, but only approximated within a very restricted time-space assumption. In other words, linear, spatial, invariant space. This is exactly why all the exercises in any science textbook are repeatable, but approximated. Conclusion. In conclusion, I have shown that physically realizable science cannot be repeated, since it is an only once reality. Yet applicable science must be repeatable, thus approximated. We have seen it is the physically realizable principle that determines a fundamental law of science, since mathematical description science cannot be physically real. Nevertheless, it is the repeatable physics that can be exploited for application. But repeatable sciences must be approximated, for which all applicable sciences must be approximated, but cannot be strictly physically realizable. And this is a dilemma for us to draw a fine line between physically realizable principle and approximated science. Although physically realizable science is an absolute reality principle, it is not a repeatable science that can be applied, from which we see that all applicable sciences must be approximated, yet they are not strictly physically realizable sciences, from which we see that all applicable sciences must be approximated, of which can be repeated. Thank you.